10 of the best jazz albums of all time, ranked. The best jazz albums for anyone to pick up to start, or supplement, their love of the genre. Getting into jazz is like suddenly discovering you have an extended family you knew nothing about, although the family in question runs to thousands of members. Like turning the world upside down and finding another one underneath, a world where they only ever listen to jazz. So, how do you build a collection? What do you do once you've wandered off into the jazz section? What do you buy? Not only is there just so much stuff, but it's an ever-expanding world. Even if you knew everything there was to know about jazz, how could you possibly own it all? As with any other type of music, there are some classic records you'd be mad to ignore. But with jazz you really have to plow your own furrow. Firstly, what is jazz, anyway? Is it Coop's Waltz for Coop, a Swedish approximation of loungecore jazz? Or is it Terry Callier's Turn You to Love, which is almost deep soul but is released on Elektra's Classic Jazz label? The truth is, jazz is a bit of everything. Something that isn't so surprising when you consider it was born out of marching bands, the blues, and New Orleans Creole. Jazz is Dixieland, swing fusion, jazz funk, jazz rock, R&B, bossa nova, bebop, hard bop, hip-hop, cool jazz, hot jazz, free jazz, trad jazz, modern cheroot-smoking Santa-pressed sporting jazz, the lot. Some people now even call it the new chill-out. With that in mind, it's hard to narrow down the 100 best jazz albums, let alone pick the top 10. And yet, we've made a go of it. Here's our pick of some of the best jazz albums for you to pick up to start, or supplement, your love of the genre. 10. Billie Holiday, Lady in Satin, 1958. Released the year before her untimely death, Lady in Satin was to become Billie Holiday's penultimate album, but the last to arrive while she was still alive. Although it's widely acclaimed today, the record was initially met with mixed reviews, largely because of Holiday's drastically altered voice, which had become raspy and lost much of its upper range due to years of alcohol and drug abuse. Ray Ellis, who conducted and arranged a 40-piece orchestra for the album, was a fan of Holiday's changed vocals, describing them as very evil, sensuous, and sultry, with evil meaning earthy, rather than something sinister. Lady in Satin also marked Holiday's return to Columbia Records after 16 years, and was seen as a new beginning, one in which she would record new tracks, as opposed to re-recording old material. Although the record ultimately marked the end of Holiday's life, as opposed to a new start, it saw her go out with a bang, and, for many, remains the high point of her career. 9. Louis Armstrong, The Complete Hot 5 and Hot 7 Recordings, 2000. A maverick vocalist and trumpeter, Louis Armstrong was one of the most important musicians the U.S. has ever produced. His career not only spanned most of the 20th century, but incorporated every diffident type of music, from gospel and blues to hillbilly and pop. Armstrong's unmistakable voice, full of cracks and fissures, is a cornerstone of early jazz. And his trumpet work is nothing short of pioneering. This 2000 collection of his best work, The Complete Hot 5 and Hot 7 Recordings, from 1925 to 29, includes some of the earliest recorded jazz, as well as the track, West End Blues, which was once called, the most perfect 3 minutes of music ever created. 8. Duke Ellington, Far East Suite, 1967. In his 50-year career, Duke Ellington composed over 2,000 pieces of jazz, including sprawling orchestral suites, pop songs, dances tunes, and everything in between. He also kept an orchestra on the road his whole professional life, and in that respect resembled Bob Dylan, and his never-ending tour, a wandering journeyman. It was this lust for travel that caused him to visit the Middle East and Japan in 1963 and 1964, a tour that resulted in Far East Suite, an album ranking among his greatest achievements. 7. John Coltrane, A Love Supreme, 1964. John Coltrane's A Love Supreme is one of the most popular jazz records of all time, and a collection of songs that highlight jazz at its very highest level of achievement. Coltrane was a genius, but he's also tagged with encouraging everyone who came in his wake to think a saxophone solo could last several weeks. When Coltrane died, aged 40, Philip Larkin wrote that the only compliment one could pay him was one of stature. If he was boring, he was enormously boring. If he was ugly, he was massively ugly. Nevertheless, A Love Supreme is genius. 6. Nina Simone, Little Girl Blue, jazz as played in an exclusive side street club, 1959. Little Girl Blue, jazz as played in an exclusive side street club is Nina Simone's debut album and her first classic. It was actually recorded over 14 hours in a single day in 1957. Over a year before its release, and, in light of Simone's frustration with the delay and Bethlehem Records' resistance to release a single, ended up being the only album she made with her first label, although that didn't stop the label from capitalizing on these early recordings for years after they were released. As well as including some of her most famous hits, Love Me or Leave Me, I Loves You, Porgy, and My Baby Just Cares for Me. Little Girl Blue introduced Simone as an accomplished jazz pianist and exceptional vocalist, and set her up for what would become an inimitable career. 5. The Dave Brubeck Quartet, Time Out, 1959. In the late 50s, Brubeck became the biggest jazz star in America, a white pianist who conquered a middle America just coming to terms with the expansionist populux dreams of suburbia. He was the hipster it was okay to like. Brubeck's critics thought he was all puff and bluster. His audience, enjoy being offered titles such as, Blue Rondo Ala Turk, wrote one. Because the implication is there that they understand blues, rondos, and even Turks. Time Out contains Take 5, one of the most popular jazz records of all time, and deservedly so. Not owning this record is like not owning Revolver or London Calling. 4. Charlie Parker, Yardbird Suite, 2000. Parker was the king of bop, the fastest saxophonist in the West, and at the time, the mid-40s, one of the coolest men in America. This collection, Yardbird Suite, has many of his classics, Ornithology, Coco, Groovin' High, as well as his greatest ever recording, the incomparable, A Night in Tunisia, which must rank as not only just one of the greatest jazz records of all time, but one of the greatest records, period. Parker had a terrible impulse towards self-destruction, and before his untimely death in 1955, from a heroin overdose, he was 34, although the coroner thought he was 60, became quite adept at burning the candelabra at all ends. As well as being responsible for recording some of the finest music of the 20th century, he also came up with the ultimate jazz truism: if you play something that seems be wrong, play it again. Then play the same thing a third time. Then they'll think that you meant it. 3. Ella Fitzgerald. Ella Fitzgerald sings the Cole Porter Songbook, 1956. Ella Fitzgerald Sings the Cole Porter Songbook is the record that turned a great American voice into a national treasure. This collection was the brainchild of Norman Granz, the founder of Verve Records, who had been trying to sign Ella Fitzgerald for 6 years, thinking she had been recording substandard material. When he finally got her, he put her in a studio for 3 days, and this is the result. It was so successful he followed it with collections based around Rodgers and Hart, Duke Ellington, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin, and Kern and Mercer, although the Cole Porter Songbook was the most memorable. Her version of Every Time We Say Goodbye puts Mick Hucknall in his place. 2. Stan Getz and João Gilberto, Getz, Gilberto, 1964. For half a century, Astrud Gilberto has been singing the gentle, lyrical samba ballads of Brazil, a career kick-started by happy accident in a New York recording studio in 1963. Early that year, Stan Getz called up the Brazilian pianist Antonio Carlos Jobim, asking him to bring along some of his new material. Getz was looking to record the follow-up to Jazz Samba and Jazz Samba Encore, his two breakthrough LPs, which had resulted in the hits, Desatinado, and, One Not Samba. The sensual, sun-kissed samba Jobim brought to the studio that day was The Girl from Ipanema. He also brought along a friend, the guitarist João Gilberto. The song vividly showcased Getz's pure-toned tenor sax and the intimate, burry voice of Gilberto. Though as recording progressed, it became evident that Gilberto could only sing in Portuguese. And so Getz asked Gilberto's 24-year-old Bahia-born wife Astrud to sing it for him. Her contribution was initially considered so slight that she was not even credited on the album. Though stardom beckoned when an edited version of the song went to number 5 in the US charts. It's just one of many phenomenal classics on Getz and Gilberto's aptly titled, Getz, Gilberto. 1. Miles Davis, Kind of Blue, 1959. Miles Davis's soft, muted trumpet sound, dry as a martini, has become synonymous with cool jazz, and there is no better example of the genre, or of his art, than Kind of Blue. The album is the best-selling recording in Davis's catalog and the best-selling classic jazz album ever. It regularly tops all-time favorite lists, and has become a template for what a jazz record is meant to be. It's also perhaps the most influential jazz record ever released. Musically, it's where modal jazz really hit pay dirt, and where linear improvisation came to the fore, Davis playing Samuel Beckett to John Coltrane's James Joyce, and its tunes have been covered by everyone from Larry Carlton to Ronnie Jordan. Its influence is far-reaching. Breathe, from Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon was based on a chord sequence from this album. From its vapory piano and bass introduction to the full-flight sophistication of flamenco sketches, Kind of Blue is the very personification of modern cool. And, according to Steely Dan's Donald Fagen, it's also something else far more important, sexual wallpaper.